Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and I have for you something a bit different today. Thrift Store Horror is my collaborator on the channel. I use them for resources on what to read next and how to get books that I'm missing. And in some cases, I'm tracking down the wrong book entirely because it's the UK release and I already have the United States release. Anyway, recommendation was 13 Tales of Horror by 13 Masters of Horror. This is a compilation novel. It's all short stories. I have not read this before, but it came highly recommended by Thrift Store Horror. So we have stories by R.L. Stine, Caroline B. Cooney, Christopher Pike, D.E. Atkins, A. Bates, J. Bennett, Carol Ellis, Diane Ho, Lael Littke, Sinclair Smith, J.B. Stamper, Ellen Emerson White, and Patricia Windsor. Half of these authors have worked with Scholastic and Point Horror in the past. This should be pretty fun. And we all know about R.L. Stine and Christopher Pike, right? Believe it or not, I haven't really read any Diane Ho, or Sinclair Smith, or Caroline B. Cooney, but I do have a Cooney novel in the works, so stay tuned for that. I will be reading one story from this compilation and then publishing that as its own episode. I'm going to use this book like glue. If there's any holes or gaps or weirdness going on in my schedule, I'll be using one of these stories to fill that void. Just something fun to do. So let's begin. If you would like to get in touch with me, you can write me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I am also on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the join button to show your support. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me narrate them a story. Thank you very much for listening, and let's begin. Welcome to a Nightfall Audiobooks production of Dedicated to the One I Love by Diane Ho. Marla Medwick's bedroom reeked of the acrid smell of nail polish. Marla, her blonde head bent over cotton-separated bare toes, sat on one bed, concentrating on a careful application of peach pleasure. Lee Drum and Carrie Carbone, equally lost in the task at hand, occupied the bed's twin opposite Marla. All three sang along with the music from the radio at Marla's right elbow. "I love this song," Carrie said dreamily as she brought the tiny brush down toward her foot. "It's so romantic. Turn it up, Marla." Red-haired Lee, the only one of the three with enough courage, or as Marla put it, bad taste, to indulge in frosted fuchsia frolic, made a gagging sound. "Romantic. It's just plain corny. All that garbage about true love makes me sick." "Don't be bitter, Lee," Carrie said softly. "You sound like you're the only person in the world who's been stepped on. We've all been there, remember?" Before Lee could reply, the voice of their favorite DJ, Bobby G, interrupted. "This next song here on Cool 98, the place for all your favorites, is dedicated to Carrie Carbone." Three heads snapped up. Three pairs of ears sprang to attention like retrievers in a field of birds. "By someone who loves her. Enjoy, Carrie." As the first strains of the song surrounded them, two pairs of eyes shot to Carrie Carbone, expecting to see pleased surprise on her face. There was surprise, but there was no pleasure apparent in Carrie's delicate features. Her skin was as white as the wall behind her, her brown eyes were wide with shock, and her lower lip trembled. "Carrie, what's wrong?" Marla asked. "That's," Carrie swallowed and tried again. "That was our song, Richie's and mine. It's You Turn Me On." Her voice rose. "It was our song?" Lee and Marla stared at her. Then Lee shook her head, tightened her lips, and said grimly, "We promised we weren't going to talk about him." She lay down on the bed, her long hair splayed out around her like a red cape. "So can it, Carrie?" "Lee, I loved him," Carrie said softly. Tears pulled in her eyes. "Well, so did I, so did Marla, which only goes to show how stupid this trio is." "We weren't stupid," Marla said staunchly. "We trusted him, that's all. He told me it would be better if no one knew we were dating because he was older than me and my parents would object. I never guessed that it was really because he was dating you two at the same time." She sighed heavily. "It's probably the only time in our lives we didn't tell each other something, and look where it got us. We can't even talk about him without getting the shakes." "I can," Lee disagreed. "He was a first-class jerk. No, I take that back. He wasn't even first class, just a jerk." The look of shock on Carrie's face had been replaced by confusion. "But I never told anyone that was our song," she said nervously. "Richie wouldn't have told either. It was our private song. How would anyone know that? And even if someone did, Why would they dedicate it to me now, when Richie's not around to hear it? The three sat in an uneasy silence. Lee broke it by saying, "Well, if you didn't tell anyone, Richie must have. I mean, he couldn't have made the request." Marla interrupted by shaking her head and saying quickly, "Lee's right, Carrie. Richie told someone about your song. That has to be what happened." Then she was seized by a sudden chill and began trembling. She wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders. The evening ruined. Lee and Carrie went home soon after the last note of "You Turn Me On" had faded away. Too upset to sleep, Carrie Carbone decided on a hot bath before bed. She tucked her radio under one arm, taking it into the bathroom with her. As she placed it on the counter opposite the bathtub and plugged it in, she sighed softly. "You're all I've got to turn on now," she said, "now that Richie isn't here." As she turned to step into the bath, a warm breeze ruffled the curtains at the open window opposite the counter where the radio sat. Lost in anger and sadness, Carrie didn't notice. And because the window was behind her, she didn't see the small but rapidly widening blob of gray-green muck spreading across the white wooden sill. Carrie stepped into the tub. Marla was awakened the next morning by a phone call from a hysterical Lee. "It's Carrie," she sobbed. "Oh, Marla, Carrie's dead." Marla pulled herself upright in bed. "Dead? Lee, that's not funny." "No, it's true." Lee could barely speak, she was so upset. "She was electrocuted last night. She was taking a bath, and she had her radio on a counter next to the tub. Her mother said she must have reached out to turn it on while she was still in the water. The radio fell into the tub, and—" Marla sat frozen in shocked silence. Carrie? Carrie was dead? Her friend since 5th grade? The one who knew everything about her? She had been electrocuted? How could that be true? "No," she whispered. "No, it's not true. Not Carrie." "It's true," Lee sobbed. "I can't believe it either. I feel so awful. We argued on the way home from your house. She was so upset about hearing that song, and she kept babbling about Richie. I couldn't stand it. I yelled at her to shut up about him." Lee's voice fell to a harsh whisper. "I didn't even tell her goodbye when she got out of the car." Lee's guilt tore at Marla, but she was too upset herself to find the comforting word she needed. Unable to talk, they hung up in tears. When the horror of Carrie's funeral service was behind them, Marla and Lee returned to school, white-faced and thoroughly shaken. Although she didn't feel like talking to anyone, Marla couldn't help commenting at the crowded lunch table. "I think it's weird that someone requested a song for Carrie right before she died. Bobby G had never played a request for Carrie until that night." She glanced around the table with her tear-swollen eyes. "Don't you think that's weird?" Toying disconsolately with her sandwich, Lee nodded glumly. But Tina, who was sitting beside her, frowned and said, "Bobby G, the night Carrie died. He didn't play a song for her. I never heard a request for Carrie. I remember because the next day I heard what happened to her, and I thought, gee, there I was, just hanging out, listening to the radio, and poor Carrie was dying. Bizarre." Tina took a sip of her soda. "I'd remember if he played a song for her." "I'm with Tina," a boy named Donald agreed. "Nobody played a song for Carrie that night." Alan, opposite him, nodded. "Yeah, I was listening till after midnight. Bobby G never mentioned her name." Marla stared at her friends. "You're kidding, right? That's mean." Tears gathered in her eyes. "How can you joke now? About Carrie? Lee and I both heard that request." "We wouldn't joke about Carrie," Tina insisted, standing and gathering up her books. "Marla, Bobby G didn't play a song for her that night. You and Lee must have been listening to another station or something." As everyone but Lee left the table, Marla questioned people sitting at other tables. "You heard it, didn't you?" she prodded repeatedly, her voice rising as her frustration and bewilderment grew. But the answer was always the same. No one except she and Lee had heard the request for Carrie Carbone on the night she died. "I don't believe this," Marla cried, turning back to Lee. "How could they not have heard it?" "They probably weren't even listening," Lee replied with a weary shrug. "How can they remember what they were doing that night?" But Marla couldn't shrug off her confusion so easily. The strange fact that only she and Lee had heard the request nagged at her. How could that be? It seemed almost as bizarre as the way Carrie had died. Marla had been thinking about Richie too much. Maybe that was the problem. Maybe her mind was getting too tired, playing tricks on her. If only people would stop talking about Richie and how he left town so suddenly with just a note for his aunt and uncle. He hadn't even bothered to tell any of his friends goodbye. "Well, that's Richie," they'd say. "He never did want to be tied down." She had to stop thinking about him. But she wasn't the only one who'd heard the request. Was Lee Drum hearing things, too? The following night, Marla was trying to study in the quiet of her bedroom when Lee called, shouting at Marla to turn on the radio. "Get Bobby G," she cried. "Someone's dedicating a song to me. Hurry up!" Marla obeyed. Bobby G's deep melodious voice filled the room. "So here's Falling for You for Lee Drum, requested by someone who loves her." Marla's stomach did a somersault, and then Lee's enthusiasm faltered as the song's title was announced. "This is really creepy, Marla." Marla knew what Lee was going to say before the words crossed the telephone wire. "Falling for You was our song, mine and Richie's." "Lee?" Marla asked slowly. "Did Bobby G have an open line tonight? I mean, did you hear the request made?" "Yeah, I did, but..." "But what?" "Well, I didn't exactly recognize it. I mean, it was real low, almost a whisper, but it sounded a little bit like... No, you'll think I've lost it. It's too weird." Marla drew in a deep breath. "Lee? What? Who was it?" "It sounded a lot like Richie's voice." "Lee, that's impossible. Richie's not around." I know. It couldn't be. I said it was too strange. It sounded like him, that's all." Marla took another deep breath. It was probably some sick joker trying to sound like Richie. Someone who's mad at him for leaving town without saying goodbye. What a rotten sense of humor. "Yeah, I guess." But Lee didn't sound convinced. Saying she might as well listen to the song, since it had been requested for her, Lee hung up. Lee's remarks about the voice kept Marla tossing and turning in bed. If she asked around at school tomorrow, would the kids say they hadn't heard Falling for You? Would they insist that Bobby G hadn't played it tonight? I'm not going to ask, she decided as she rolled over and buried her face in the pillow, because I don't want to know if no one heard it but me and Lee. Sometimes it's better not to know. Sometime during the night, Lee Drum awoke in the darkness and felt her stomach growling. Knowing she wouldn't be able to go back to sleep until she'd grabbed a snack, she left her room in her flowered flannel pajamas and bare feet and headed for the stairs in the dark. She made the trip countless times since her family had moved into the old Victorian house. But when Lee reached the top of the steep, narrow staircase, her left foot suddenly slid out from under her, slipping on an unseen glob of slimy gray-green goo. She lost her balance and, with a startled, murmured, "Oh!" she catapulted forward. Her body tumbled head over heels in a graceless bundle from the top of the stairs to the bottom. When she hit the hardwood floor at the base of the staircase, there was one final thud. Then silence. Marla heard the news at school. She stopped breathing momentarily as a shocked friend said, "She's not dead, but something terrible happened to her spine. Mrs. Drum told my mother Lee might not walk again. She could be paralyzed for the rest of her life." Lee Drum had studied ballet from the age of 6. She had planned to make dancing her career. Now, the long, strong legs that she had laughingly called drumsticks were useless. Leaving school, numbed with shock, her movements stiff and wooden, Marla remembered the night she discovered Lee and Richie together. She was on her way home from the library. She was humming to a song on her car radio, the windows open to let in a warm autumn breeze. Lee's house was on her way home. The big yellow Victorian was, as always, bright with lights, including the one in the wide front porch. "Maybe I'll honk," Marla thought with a grin as she approached the Drum home. "I'll start honking now and lay on the horn all the way down the street. Lee will hear it up in her room and know it's me. She'll think it's funny." But just as she leaned forward, still grinning, the porch light illuminated 2 figures dancing, very close together, in front of the chain-suspended white swing. Marla saw the tall, leggy girl she knew so well, and a taller, very cute boy whose grin could light up a room. They were dancing so close together, she couldn't have slid even one thin dime between the two of them without touching the pale blue sweater or the plaid flannel shirt. Lee and Richie, together. Her best friend and the only boy she'd ever cared about. It wasn't Lee's fault. She didn't know Marla was dating Richie, but Richie knew. And when Marla knew, and when Marla, in tears, went straight to Carrie's house and told her what had happened and mentioned Richie's name, Carrie's face had gone stark white. "Who?" she whispered. "Who did you say he was?" "Richie Creek. I didn't tell you because he said not to. He was afraid my parents would find out. He's older. I don't think you know him." And then, for the second time that night, Marla reeled in shock as Carrie answered through tears of despair. "Yes, I do, Marla. I do know him. Oh, Marla, I've been dating him too." The following night, after a long, painful session together, the 3 friends confronted Richie with his treachery. Marla was the first to speak. "What's going on, Richie?" she said quietly, while Lee fumed beside her, and Carrie, pale as a ghost, bit her lower lip nervously. "You've been dating all 3 of us at the same time? Don't you think that's pretty sleazy?" And he laughed. Laughed! Variety is the spice of life, sweetie, he said lightly. Haven't you girls ever heard that? He reached out and touched Marla's hair. We had fun, didn't we? What's the problem? You're a worm, Lee burst out furiously. Three-timer. Creep. You said you loved me, Carrie said softly, and I believed you? I feel so stupid. They all felt stupid, and they hated the feeling. I'm splitting this deadbeat town anyway, Richie said, heading for the big city where the action is. We had fun, but I gotta move on now. Feel like giving me a ride to the airport, saving me cab fare? Richie Creek sure did have nerve. Remembering the way things had happened, Marla was awash in tears as she'd been that night when she saw Lee on the porch with Richie. She had thought it was all behind them, but now, what was happening now? Bobby G had played a song that had been special to Carrie and Richie, and Carrie had died. He had played a special song to Lee and Richie, and Lee had fallen. Carrie was gone forever, Lee paralyzed. Why? Her stomach turned over. Richie was the only other person who knew about the songs. If she didn't know better, no, that was impossible. Unless she really was losing her mind. Was she going crazy? Richie wasn't around to request songs or to hurt them anymore. Then who was doing it? And why? Food began to taste like mud to Marla. She slept fitfully, her dreams filled with shadowy, haunting images of Richie and Lee and Carrie. On more than one dark night, she was jolted out of a tormented sleep by the strains of You Turned Me On or Falling for You. Yet, when she checked, her radio was off and the house was completely silent. Her jeans hung loosely on her hips, and dark shadows encircled her eyes like bruises. When she tried to study, the words reshaped themselves into images of Richie, looking up at her from the page with mocking laughter in his eyes. Slamming the textbook shut failed to erase the image. It danced around the room, taunting her, teasing, until she put her head in her hands and wept. She knew what was haunting her. It was the knowledge that all three of them had dated Richie, but only two had been attacked. 3 people had loved him, shared a secret song with him, but only 2 had suffered terribly because of it. Only 2. It wasn't finished. It couldn't be. Nothing terrible had happened to her. Not yet. She picked the nail polish from her nails, forgot to wash her hair, and wore the same clothes to school too, sometimes 3 days in a row. Her friends at school, uneasy about her appearance and behavior, began to avoid her. She missed Lee and Carrie fiercely, feeling lost and alone without them, and she was terrified. On a Saturday night after visiting Lee in the hospital, Marla was home alone, making a futile attempt at studying. Her parents had gone out. The house, set deep in a wooded area at the edge of town, was completely silent. Marla was furious at herself for letting her parents leave. Why didn't I make them stay home? Marla asked herself. Because I would have had to explain why I'm afraid. And I can't do that. I can't. Giving up on her studies, she left the desk and crawled into her bed, burrowing under the covers for safety and comfort. To break the silence, she reached out and turned on the radio. I want to request a song from Marla Medwick, a whisper breathed in her ear. Play A Knife in My Heart, and dedicate it to Marla, the girl I love. Marla froze. Oh God, here it was. But how could it be? That was her and Richie's song, and no one knew that except the two of them. Images of Richie flooded her mind, smiling, talking about his plans to see the world, bending his head to kiss her, dressed in a sport coat and tie, ready to leave town forever, ready to leave her behind, forever. That voice on the radio. She had to be mistaken. It couldn't be. How could it? Now she was next. That was the way it worked. First a song that once had been so sweet, so special, then something terrible happened, leaving the victim dead. Or worse, she was next. It was her turn. And the title of the songs told what was going to happen. Marla realized that now. Carrie's song had been You Turn Me On, and she had been electrocuted. Falling for You had been played for Lee, and Lee had taken a terrible tumble down the stairs. What lay in store for someone whose special song had been A Knife in My Heart? Oh God, she thought with sickening clarity, I'm going to be stabbed, or have my face slashed so that for the rest of my life people will turn away from me in disgust, or... She began trembling violently as she tried to pull herself into a sitting position in bed, wrapping the blankets around her like a cocoon. She had to stop it from happening. She had to. But she couldn't think straight. If only she could stop shaking, clear her mind. The police, they couldn't help her. Not with this. There was way too much she didn't understand, couldn't explain. They'd think she was crazy. Wasn't there anyone who could help her? Bobby G. This had all started with Cool 98. Marla picked up the telephone with shaking fingers and dialed the radio station. It took her a few minutes to get through. Oh, come on, she repeated anxiously to herself. Pick up the phone. Name your choice, Bobby G said finally. No, this isn't a request, Marla said, trying in vain to control the panic in her voice. I need help. You have to help me. He's going to kill me. Kill you? The disc jockey sounded amused. Who's going to kill you, honey? Richie Creek? Although the room was chilly, beads of sweat gathered on Marla's forehead. Who's Richie Creek? Marla was babbling and she knew it, but she couldn't help it. There wasn't time to talk slowly. He was my boyfriend, and Lee's and Carrie's, only none of us knew he was dating the other ones, not at first. Bobby G's voice was patient. Look, sweetie, I don't think some guy is going to put out your lights permanently just because you dumped him. No, it's not like that. We didn't dump him. We killed him. Excuse me? We killed him. Everyone thinks he left town and went to Los Angeles, but he didn't. He never got to the airport because we killed him. And Marla saw that night again, the night she had tried so hard to forget. When Richie asked for a ride to the airport, they were stunned by his gall. Of all the nerve. He'd broken their hearts and now he wanted a ride? They couldn't believe it. But then Lee turned to Marla, a sly smile on her face, and said, Sure, why not? Who better to see you off than the 3 girls who love you? When are you leaving? Richie looked surprised but pleased. Tomorrow night, 8:15. Pick you up at 7, Lee said, and dragged a dumbfounded Marla and Carrie back to her car. Lee explained her plan during the ride home. It seemed like simple justice to Marla. Carrie was less enthusiastic, but agreed to go along. So when they picked up Richie the following night, Lee sat in the back seat with Richie, while Marla drove, sharing the front seat with Carrie, and they didn't drive to the airport. They drove instead out to Blackberry Hill Road, a dirt road winding along a foul-smelling, brackish, grayish-green swamp. Richie, in high spirits over his trip, chattered cheerfully about the new worlds he intended to conquer and what a great time he was going to have doing it. When he realized they were not on their way to the airport, he got mad. I don't have time to fool around, you guys, he said. What are we doing out here? He peered out the car window into the wide pool of greenish scum, dotted here and there with dead trees and jagged logs. God, it stinks. Relax, Richie, Lee said. This is a shortcut. But Marla could see Richie's face in the rearview mirror. He didn't take Lee's advice. He didn't relax. A noise from downstairs interrupted Marla's thoughts. She was alone in the house. There shouldn't be any noise from downstairs. Shivering, she eyed the door. It seemed suddenly fragile, no stronger than a sheet of paper. Marla dropped the phone, jumped out of bed, and ran to her desk. Grabbing the chair, she dragged it across the room and jammed the sturdy wooden back up under the doorknob. Then she flipped the lock and checked the doorknob to make sure the lock held. That done, she ran back to the bed and retrieved the phone. When the disc jockey spoke again, the patience was gone from his voice. Who is this? He demanded. And in an irritated aside, he muttered, Geez, isn't anybody screening these calls? To Marla, he added, I don't have time for jokes, kid. It's not a joke. This is Marla Medwick, 4443 Buskin Drive. Richie's going to kill me. Tonight. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. He's going to stab me. You've got to believe me. I thought you said the guy was dead. He is dead. At least, we thought he... But now... Tell me about it, the disc jockey urged suddenly, as if he had finally realized that this call wasn't a joke and it could be important. All across town, listeners picked up the tone in his voice and stopped what they were doing. Pens remained poised in midair, textbooks lay ignored on desks, blow dryers fell silent, noisy water faucets were turned off, and countless radio volume dials were turned up. Marla's eyes fastened on the chair-barricaded door. He was coming. She could feel it. Her hands gripped the receiver so tightly the skin went bone-white to the wrist. We were just going to leave him out there, she cried, her voice rising precariously. Make him walk or hitchhike back to town? We figured it would give him time to think about what he'd done to us. He had it coming, didn't he? Her face flushed scarlet. Well, didn't he? She demanded angrily. Made you mad, did he? Bobby G said gently. There was another sound from downstairs. Marla sank down on the bed and pressed her back up against the wall. We made him get out of the car, Marla whispered into the phone, her breathing ragged and raspy. She never took her eyes off the door. Lee had her little brother's toy gun. It looks real. Lee forced him out of the car, and Richie stood there beside the swamp, his eyes wide with disbelief. You guys are nuts, he yelled in fury. He grabbed for the door handle, yanked it open, tried to dive into the back seat, but Lee kicked him out. He grunted and fell backward, and Lee pulled the door shut, slamming it hard. I was the one driving, Marla told the disc jockey breathlessly, and when she yelled, "Go!" I took off really fast. So was the guy still out there, or what? Marla swallowed hard. Her eyes remained glued to the bedroom door, waiting. No, Lee was so upset she wasn't paying attention, or she'd have noticed the tie right away. The tie? Was that the sound of footsteps on the stairs? Richie was all dressed up for the trip. I don't know who he was trying to impress. We weren't impressed. Her voice fell to a whisper again. We'd only gone a few feet when Lee started screaming. His tie, his tie. I thought she lost her mind. And she had? At the radio station, Bobby G was sitting up very straight in his brown swivel chair, his ear glued to the telephone in his hand. No, oh God, no. It was Richie's tie, stuck inside the back door, and... A sob of horror escaped Marla's lips. He was still attached to it. She could still see it so clearly. She slammed down on the brakes, hard, bringing the car to a shrieking standstill. They jumped out, and there he was, only it didn't look like Richie anymore, not after being dragged along that hard, stony road. Geez, you dragged him? Wasn't the doorknob turning the tiniest bit? Marla stood up. We didn't know he was there, she moaned. We didn't. We couldn't believe he was dead. I guess he was strangled because his face was all purplish and his head hung funny. The phone cord, set in motion by her violent trembling, slapped crazily against the wooden bedside table. Bobby G exhaled deeply. He raised a hand to the sound engineer in the booth, tracing a 9 and 2 1s in the air. The engineer nodded and began dialing a telephone at his elbow. The doorknob was turning. Marla, her eyes still on the door, began backing away from the bed, moving as far as possible from the door. When we saw what we'd done, we knew we couldn't take him back to town. No one would believe it was an accident. Everyone knew we were mad at him for what he'd done to us. Remembering, Marla felt sick and faint. If it hadn't been for Lee, they'd have stood there screaming all night long. So she made them snap out of it. We have to get rid of him, Lee said, bending down to take Richie's bleeding hands. Help me. When Marla and Carrie, paralyzed with shock, didn't move, Lee screamed again, Help me with him. So what did you do? Bobby G asked slowly. Marla sobbed, we put him in the swamp. Their eyes clouded with horrified tears. The girls had dragged and pulled and tugged until Ritchie Creek sank like a stone into the disgusting greenish sludge. Gone forever, Lee said dully, watching the muck bubble up in protest over the new arrival. But she had been wrong. Ritchie wasn't gone forever, after all. What else could we do? Marla asked Bobby G, her voice a pitiful whine. Everyone would have thought we'd killed him on purpose to get even, and we hadn't. I swear it was an accident. Right. Lee said nothing ever comes back up out of the swamp, but she was wrong. Solid wall bumped up against her spine. She could move no further away from the door. Richie did come back up. He's here now. In a thin, high-pitched voice, she said, I know he is. I can feel it. You have to help me. He's going to kill me. Is this for real? The disc jockey asked her. You dumped a body in the swamp out on Blackberry Hill Road? We had to, Marla shrieked, all control gone now. We had no choice, can't you see that, can't you? When the stench hit Marla's nostrils so suddenly, so powerfully, her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor. That smell. She knew that horrid, unforgettable odor. Nothing else smelled like that. You have to help me, she sobbed, her eyes wide with horror fastened on the door. You're the one who played the songs. If you hadn't done that... Songs? What songs? Our special songs with Richie. Lee's and Carrie's and mine. You turned me on, and Falling for You, and tonight you played A Knife in My Heart. That was our song, mine and Richie's. That's how I knew he was coming to get me. You played it a few minutes ago. It seemed like hours. Sorry, kiddo, he must have your stations mixed up. Haven't played any of those songs in ages. I mean, you are kind of confused, aren't you? Marla knew he meant crazy. She didn't care. What difference did it make now? Richie had come for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. No one was going to help her. She was lost. As she replaced the telephone receiver and tried to climb wearily to her feet, she heard the faint wail of a police siren approaching her house. Her legs wouldn't work properly. She couldn't stand up. The terrible stench was overpowering. Her face swollen and tear-streaked, her body moving sluggishly, she crawled on her hands and knees to the door, and saw, oozing in under the door, a thick, gooey puddle of grayish-green slime. She knew what it was immediately. She had scrubbed and scrubbed that night, trying desperately to erase every last trace of the foul, stinking stuff from her hands and knees and from under her fingernails. She still awoke at night, terrified, thinking she was coated with the disgusting stuff. She knew the swamp sludge well. Outside, car doors slammed. Feet slapped up the sidewalk and onto the wooden porch. Fists pounded on the door. "Police, open up," voices demanded. I'm safe, Maria thought. They were here. She had made it. The terrible thing wasn't going to happen to her, like it had to Carrie and Lee. She was safe. "Come on, open this door," the voices shouted. She would do that. She would go downstairs and open the front door and let the police in, let them save her. "I'm coming," she called out eagerly. Rising to her feet, she went to the door and moved the chair. She was breathing more easily now. Careful to avoid the puddle of sludge, she put her hand on the doorknob and turned it. Let them put her in prison forever. She didn't care. At least, she'd be safe there. Straddling the slop of pale muck, she slowly pulled open the door and stepped out of the room. Her sigh of relief became a shriek of terror as the glow from the ceiling light danced across the wide metal blade, descending rapidly toward her throat. The shriek ended in a shocked whisper as the blade met its target. Eyes full of disbelief, Marla remained upright for a second or two, watching bright red streams of her own blood explode against the white walls, creating a brilliant scarlet design. "No," she whispered. "No, Richie." Then, in slow motion, she sank to the floor, her back against the wall. Her head slid sideways, resting on her shoulder. After one final weak gurgle of protest, Marla closed her eyes forever. As the police broke down the front door and pounded up the stairs, a thick pool of bright red blood crept across the floor and overtook the puddle of murky green. With a soft, whispered sigh of satisfaction, the swamp sludge allowed itself to be absorbed by the bright red until there wasn't a trace of green anywhere in sight. This has been a Nightfall Audiobooks production of Dedicated to the One I Love by Diane Ho. Hi, this is Chris with Nightfall Audiobooks, and thank you very much for joining me for my production of Dedicated to the One I Love by Diane Ho. I belonged to a book club called Midnight Fright way back in the day. My mom was cool enough to sign me up for this thing, and you got a book every month, and you got some stickers and some pencils. I might still have my purple, unsharpened Midnight Fright pencil somewhere. I still have my Fear Street bookmark from that. And I got a few Diane Ho books. At the time, I was such an R.L. Stine snob, I just ignored them. I would read the synopsis on the back and I would go, yeah, if I want horror, if I want death, if I want murder, I'll just dial up R.L. Stine. And that's what I did. So I got a few Diane Ho books, and I never ever read them. I really should have, though, because this was fantastic. How much of a scumbag is Richie? What is with this trope in the 90s with the scumbag men dating the girls? R.L. Stine wrote a book called Double Date, in which Bobby Newkirk decides to date not one, but both sisters and their twins because he's such a ladies' man and he just wants to check that thing off his list. What's better than dating one twin sister? Why, I'll date both twins. That'll be great. He gets his comeuppance in that story, and that's wonderful. So this guy, Richie Creek, might as well be Richie Creep. He decides to date not one, but 3 best friends at the same time? Holy cow, what an ego on this guy. Planning to leave him in the middle of nowhere so he would get his comeuppance? That was a great idea. Make him walk or hitchhike all the way back home to the airport, wherever it is he has to go? Even better, make him drag his stuff, all of his luggage. He's going to be hurting by the time he gets back to civilization. Maybe he'll think about what he's done and think about why it was such a bad idea, and maybe he'll have a better understanding on how to handle himself in the future and stop being such a creep. As unlikely as it is, his tie ends up getting caught in the car somehow, and they drag him to death, and he dies and gets choked by his own tie along the side of the car, and the 3 girls panic and they just chuck him into the swamp. There is something to swamps and their supernatural abilities. Jonathan Mayberry wrote the Pine Deep trilogy, and that deals with a swamp that creates its own set of creatures and evil. Things emerge from the swamp, and real creatures of horror are born. If you want some very good horror, but also very depressing horror, I would definitely check out Jonathan Mayberry's Pine Deep trilogy. But this was well done. This short story was amazing. I think it was my favorite out of all of these in the 13 Tales of Horror so far. The way that Marla calls the DJ and confesses to everything and tells him what had happened, and she's watching the horror unfold in front of her in real time, that was amazing. The illustration was well done. It was really cool, and the imagery of the blood exploding out of her neck as a knife sliced her throat and just spraying all over the wall, that was really cool. I need to check out more Diane Ho. So what should I read next? I don't know. Send me an email, nightfallaudiobooks@gmail.com. I'm also at home right here on YouTube at Nightfall Audiobooks. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that join button to show your support. Any help is greatly appreciated. I really do mean that. I also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/nightfallaudiobooks. So tell your friends, tell your mom, tell whoever you think would like to listen to me, tell them tales of horror. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time.